Stop whatever you are doing right now. Because what I am about to tell you is not a music story. It is not a celebrity biography. It is not another feel-good documentary about a rock legend who made it big and lived happily ever after. What I am about to tell you is the story of a human being who spent over 60 years walking past a locked door inside himself, performing joy so convincingly for the world that no one thought to ask whether he was okay, carrying a secret so devastating that when he finally spoke it out loud at 75 years old, the entire entertainment world went silent. This is the story of a boy born in the dust of a Mexican village who was never supposed to make it past the border. A boy who had something stolen from him before he ever touched a stage. A man who built a cathedral of sound out of the rubble of his own suffering. Who collapsed in front of thousands of people at 74 years old not because he was weak, but because he had spent his entire life giving everything to everyone except himself. And then, in the ruins of that collapse, did something more revolutionary than winning 8 Grammy Awards in a single night. He told the truth. I am going to ask you something before we go any further. Has anyone in your life ever worn a smile as armor? Have you ever watched someone perform happiness so perfectly that you assumed they were fine, never once asking what they were protecting underneath it? Because that is the story of Carlos Santana. Not the legend, the man. And by the time this is over, you will never hear the word survival the same way again. Here is something the history books do not tell you. Every guitar god, every stadium legend, every artist whose name becomes synonymous with a sound that stops time, every single one of them has a locked room. A place inside themselves that the world never sees, never applauds, never puts on a greatest hits compilation. For Carlos Santana, that locked room was in Tijuana. And for 60 years, he walked past it every single day without ever opening the door. The reason he finally opened it, and the way the world responded when he did, is what makes this story unlike anything you have ever heard. But to understand the ending, you have to understand the beginning. And the beginning did not start on a stage. It started in the dust. The town was Autlán de Navarro, in the state of Jalisco, Mexico. The year was 1947. And into a household balanced permanently on the knife edge of dignity and survival, a boy was born who would one day make the entire world weep with 6 strings and a sound that had no name in any existing genre. His name was Carlos Augusto Alves Santana. He owned almost nothing. The family ate what the land allowed. His father, Jose Santana, was a traveling mariachi violinist who disappeared for weeks at a time chasing pesos on distant stages, leaving behind a silence in the house that felt less like peace and more like abandonment dressed in good clothes. His mother, Josefina, was the kind of woman that history produces in times of scarcity. Quiet, unbreakable, impossible to destroy. She held the family together the way a river holds its banks. Not because it wants to, but because stopping was never an option. Young Carlos watched all of it. He watched his father return from road trips with calloused hands and distant eyes. He watched his mother's face whenever the money ran short. He absorbed the weight of a household balanced on the edge of dignity, and somewhere in that watching, something fierce and irreversible took root in him. Not just a love of music, a need for it. A need for a language that could carry him somewhere his circumstances could not follow. His father placed a violin in his hands first. It was the family instrument, the inherited path. But the violin felt like someone else's story. Then came the guitar. And something clicked into place with a certainty that had no rational explanation. He was barely a teenager when his family crossed the border into Tijuana, chasing the promise of steadier work, steadier meals, a steadier life. Tijuana, in the early 1960s, was a city of thresholds. Between poverty and possibility. Between Mexico and America. Between who you were and who you might become. For Carlos, it was also a city of wounds. Because it was in Tijuana that his childhood was stolen. He would not speak about it for decades. But when he finally did at 75 years old, in an interview that left the entertainment world momentarily breathless, what he revealed changed the way everyone understood every note he had ever played. He disclosed that he had been sexually abused as a child, the exploitation beginning when he was around 10 years old. The predator was someone who used music as bait, as access, as control. Let that land for a moment. A child who had found the one language that made the world feel safe, who had discovered in 6 strings the only honest conversation of his young life, had that language weaponized against him by someone who should have protected him. For 60 years, that secret lived inside him like a locked room he walked past every day but never opened. It shaped his hunger. It sharpened his need for the stage. It explained, perhaps, why the guitar became not just an instrument but a lifeline. The one place where his body belonged entirely to him. Where no one could reach inside and take anything. Do you understand now why the music sounds the way it does? Why every note seems to carry something heavier than melody? By his mid-teens, Carlos had crossed into San Francisco, following his family as they chased the American dream northward. The city was trembling on the edge of a cultural revolution. The air smelled of change and rebellion. A Mexican teenager with accented English, second-hand clothes, and fingers that moved across strings like water found its own level stepped into that city, carrying everything Autlán had given him and everything Tijuana had taken. He washed dishes at the TikTok restaurant on Fisherman's Wharf during the day. At night, he played for tips. For anyone who would listen. For the simple and desperate need to exist in sound when the silence became too loud. He was nobody. He was invisible. He was exactly where every legend begins. At the very bottom, looking up at a sky so vast it should have been terrifying. For Carlos Santana, it was only an invitation. San Francisco in 1966 did not simply welcome Carlos Santana. It detonated around him. The city was a powder keg of revolution, political, spiritual, musical, and Carlos arrived at precisely the moment the fuse was lit. Haight-Ashbury pulsed with the wild, desperate energy of a generation that had decided the old world was finished, and the new one had not yet been named. In that electric uncertainty, a young Mexican dishwasher with a second-hand guitar walked into the Fillmore Auditorium and heard something that rearranged the architecture of his soul. Blues. Raw, aching, merciless blues. B.B. King. Muddy Waters. Men who had converted suffering into sound with a precision that felt almost surgical. Carlos stood in the crowd and understood, not intellectually but physically, in his chest, in his hands, that this was the language he had been searching for since Autlin. The language that did not require translation. The language that said everything the locked room inside him could not. He stopped washing dishes. He started playing streets, parks, any stage that would have him. And slowly, inevitably, San Francisco began to notice. The Santana Blues Band formed in 1966 with the kind of chaotic, combustible energy that only happens when the right people find each other at exactly the right moment. Their sound, a collision of blues, rock, and Afro-Latin percussion that had never existed before in precisely that form, was not designed in a rehearsal room. It erupted from necessity. From the need to say something that no existing genre had the vocabulary for. And then came Woodstock. August 1969. 500,000 people. A generation gathered in a field to declare itself. Carlos Santana walked onto that stage virtually unknown outside San Francisco and walked off it a legend. The performance of Soul Sacrifice, 14 minutes of escalating, almost violent musical ecstasy, is still studied today as one of the defining moments in the history of live music. Cameras captured the crowd. They captured the band. But what they truly captured was the face of a young man from Jalisco, discovering in real time that the world had been waiting for exactly this sound. Within a year, the debut album climbed to number 4 on the Billboard charts. Abraxas followed. Then Santana 3. 3 albums. 3 years. A transformation from unknown to untouchable. But here is the question that never appears in the celebration. What does a man do with that much light when he has spent his entire life learning to survive in the dark? Carlos did not handle fame the way the music industry expected. He did not become a rock star in the conventional sense. The parties, the excess, the deliberate performance of invincibility. Instead, he turned inward. Deeply, almost dangerously inward. By the early 1970s, he had encountered Sri Chinmoy, an Indian spiritual teacher whose philosophy of inner peace and divine consciousness offered something the stadiums never could. The promise of silence that healed rather than suffocated. Carlos surrendered to it completely. He meditated for hours. He changed his name to Devadip, meaning the lamp, light, and eye of God. He restructured his entire life around spiritual discipline, rising before dawn, eating with monastic restraint, subjecting every creative decision to his guru's approval. His band watched with confusion. His fans watched with bewilderment. The music industry watched with barely concealed contempt. And his wife, Deborah King, whom he married in 1973, watched with the quiet, accumulating grief of a woman who understood she was not losing her husband to another person, but to something she could neither compete with nor fully comprehend. Was it peace or was it avoidance? Was the spiritual devotion a genuine path to healing? Or was it a beautifully constructed fortress around the locked room in Tijuana that still had not been opened? Those closest to him suspected they already knew the answer. The boy who had converted pain into music had found a new conversion, a new language for the same silence. And while the world debated the quality of his albums and the sincerity of his beliefs, Carlos Santana continued doing the only thing he had ever truly known how to do. He kept playing, because the guitar, at least, never asked him questions he was not yet ready to answer. By the late 1990s, Carlos Santana had been carrying a particular kind of collapse for years, and almost no one could see it. On the surface, the story should have been triumphant. He was a living legend. His influence stretched across genres, across continents, across generations of musicians who cited him as the reason they first picked up a guitar. He had survived the turbulent 70s, navigated the commercial uncertainty of the 80s, and emerged with his reputation not merely intact but elevated. The kind of reverence reserved for artists who outlast trends because they were never truly part of one. But reverence, as Carlos was learning, is a cold companion at midnight. His marriage to Deborah had endured nearly 2 decades, and in that endurance there was love. Genuine, rooted, real. But there was also distance. The spiritual devotion that had consumed him through the 70s and 80s had carved a geography between them that tenderness alone could not bridge. He was present in the house but absent in ways that mattered. She had raised their 3 children with a steadiness that quietly absorbed his absences without ever fully forgiving them. And the music that had once erupted from him like water from a cracked dam, urgent, unstoppable, necessary, had begun to feel for the first time in his life like something he was maintaining rather than creating. Maintaining a legacy. Maintaining a catalog. Maintaining the myth of Carlos Santana when the man inside the myth was exhausted in ways he could not yet articulate. Then came 1999, and everything changed. Supernatural was not supposed to be a resurrection. It was supposed to be a collaborative experiment, a creative recalibration, perhaps a final act of artistic courage before a graceful retreat into elder statesmanship. No one, including Carlos himself, was prepared for what actually happened. The album detonated. Smooth featuring Rob Thomas became one of the best-selling singles in the history of popular music. The world that had respected Carlos Santana for 30 years suddenly rediscovered him with the breathless excitement of people who believed they had found something new, not understanding or perhaps not caring that the voice behind those guitar lines had been speaking this language since before most of them were born. 8 Grammy Awards in a single night. A record. A triumph so complete it felt almost fictional. And yet, does it surprise you that a man can stand at the absolute pinnacle of his career and feel in the private hours more fractured than ever before? Because that is precisely what happened. The supernatural explosion did not heal the distance in his marriage. It widened it. The schedule became merciless. Tours that consumed entire years. Promotional cycles that left no room for stillness. The relentless machinery of a commercial renaissance that demanded he perform joy constantly, publicly, convincingly. Carlos performed it beautifully. He always had. But in 2007, after 34 years of marriage, he and Deborah separated. The divorce was finalized quietly, with a dignity that protected their children and honored the genuine love that had once existed between them. He later admitted with the measured honesty of a man who has learned that blame is a luxury only the unexamined can afford. I was not always present the way I should have been. I was searching for God in the universe when perhaps I should have been searching for him in my own living room. Read that sentence again. In it lives the entire tragedy of a man who converted his wounds into wisdom, but sometimes too late and always at a cost. The years that followed the divorce were years of genuine solitude. Not the performed solitude of spiritual retreat, but the raw, undecorated solitude of a man learning, for perhaps the first time, who he actually was when no audience was watching. He toured. He played. He gave the world the music it demanded. But off stage, the locked room in Tijuana still waited. The wound that had been buried under decades of spirituality, success, and the magnificent distraction of being Carlos Santana had not healed. It had only been patient. And patience, as anyone who has ever carried an unspoken truth understands, is not the same as peace. The hardest fall was still coming. Not a divorce. Not a Grammy drought. Not a creative crisis. Something far more merciless than any of those. Something that would happen in front of thousands of people under the full blaze of stage lights with no dressing room to retreat to and no guitar to hide behind. On July 5th, 2022, at the Pine Knob Music Theater in Clarkston, Michigan, under the full blaze of stage lights in front of thousands of people who had come to witness a legend, Carlos Santana collapsed. Not metaphorically. Not quietly. He simply fell onto the stage in front of everyone. The crowd gasped. Security rushed forward. And the man who had stood on stages for over 50 years, who had survived Tijuana, Woodstock, bankruptcy, divorce, and the slow burn of 1,000 sleepless miles, lay motionless on the ground while the world held its breath. He had forgotten to eat. He had forgotten to drink water. He had been so consumed by the ritual of performance, by the sacred, almost religious act of giving the audience everything, that he had forgotten to give anything to himself. Heat exhaustion, the medical team said. Dehydration. Exhaustion compounded by a schedule that would have broken men half his age. He was 74 years old. Does that land the way it should? A man of 74 who had nothing left to prove to anyone on this earth. Still driving himself past the edge of his own body's endurance. Not out of arrogance, but out of the only compulsion he had ever truly understood. The compulsion to give. To pour himself into sound until there was nothing left. The collapse frightened everyone who loved him. But it frightened no one more than Carlos himself. Because lying on that stage in the white-hot clarity that only genuine physical crisis can produce, he understood something he had been circling for decades without ever landing on directly. He had spent his entire life performing for others what he had never fully learned to do for himself. Be present. Be still. Be enough simply by existing without the guitar, without the stage, without the music filling the silence before the silence could ask its questions. But here is where the story pivots. Here is where fate, which had spent decades delivering blows, delivered something different. Her name was Cindy Blackman Santana, a drummer of extraordinary power and precision. A woman whose relationship with rhythm was as intimate and uncompromising as his relationship with melody. They had married in 2010 in a union that felt less like a conventional romance, and more like the meeting of two forces that had been moving toward each other since before either of them understood why. Where Carlos burned with lyrical, emotionally transparent musicality, Cindy anchored with structural power. With the kind of presence that does not ask to be noticed because it is too busy holding everything together. Sound familiar? It should. Because Cindy Blackman Santana was, in the most profound sense, the thing Carlos had been searching for since a boy in Otlin watched his mother hold a fractured household together with quiet, unbreakable strength. After the collapse at Pine Knob, it was Cindy who insisted. Not gently. Not diplomatically. With the directness of a woman who had watched the person she loved pour himself into the world until there was dangerously little left. Rest, she said. Eat. Sleep. Let someone take care of you for once. For a man who had spent 74 years converting vulnerability into performance, the instruction was almost incomprehensible. And yet he listened. He canceled the remaining dates of the tour. He retreated into the stillness he had always preached but rarely practiced. And in that stillness, something extraordinary happened. The locked room, the one in Tijuana, the one he had been walking past for 60 years, finally opened. Not all at once. Not without cost. But in 2023, in a series of interviews that reverberated far beyond the music world, Carlos Santana spoke publicly and with devastating clarity about the childhood abuse he had survived. He named it. He described it. He refused at 75 years old the silence that had protected his abuser far longer than it had ever protected him. I am not ashamed, he said, his voice steady with the particular calm of a man who has finally set down something unbearably heavy. I was a child. It was not my fault. And if telling this truth helps one child feel less alone, then the telling is worth every uncomfortable moment. The entertainment world went quiet. Because what Carlos Santana did in that moment was not simply brave. It was revolutionary. A man of his stature, his generation, his cultural iconography, choosing truth over mythology, choosing healing over image, choosing the child he once was over the legend he had become. Have you ever witnessed someone put down a weight they had been carrying so long that you had forgotten it was never supposed to be theirs? That is what it looked like. The collapse at Pine Knob had looked like an ending. It was, in truth, a beginning. The most honest, most courageous, most fully human chapter of a life that had already contained more chapters than most people could carry. He was still here, scarred, softened, and for perhaps the first time, genuinely free. There is a particular kind of freedom that only arrives after everything else has been taken. Not the freedom of youth, which is really just ignorance wearing a beautiful disguise. Not the freedom of success, which is really just power pretending it has no price. But the freedom of a man who has been broken open by stages and silences, by love and loss, by the weight of a secret carried 60 years through the noise of 100,000 crowds, and who has chosen, in the ruins of all that carrying, to finally put it down. That is the freedom Carlos Santana carries at 78. He still tours. He still walks onto stages with that guitar, held the way a man holds the one thing that has never lied to him. The notes still bend. The sound still weeps and soars and bleeds in the way that no other living guitarist can replicate. Not because of technique, though the technique is extraordinary, but because every note carries the full autobiography of the man playing it. Otlin, Tijuana, the Fillmore, Woodstock, the divorce, the collapse at Pine Knob, the locked room, finally opened. You cannot fake that kind of depth. You can only earn it. His days now move at a rhythm shaped by necessity and choice in equal measure. Mornings begin with stillness. Meditation that is no longer the frantic spiritual seeking of a young man trying to outrun his own history, but the quiet practice of someone who has finally arrived somewhere and is in no hurry to leave. Cindy is there. Her presence, warm and anchoring, fills the spaces that silence once made unbearable. He eats carefully now, sleeps with intention, listens to his body with the attention he once reserved entirely for audiences. The collapse in Michigan was not a humiliation. It was an instruction. And for the first time in his life, Carlos Santana followed instructions. His fortune, estimated at over $20 million, a figure that tells only the smallest fraction of his actual legacy, has become in these later years a vehicle for something larger than acquisition. The Milagro Foundation, which he and Deborah established decades ago, and which he continues to champion with Cindy, funds education, health, and art programs for vulnerable children across the Americas. Children who are, in ways he understands better than anyone, versions of the boy from Otlin. Children who own almost nothing, who need someone to believe in their potential before they have the language to describe it themselves. I want every child to know they are a miracle, he has said, not when they succeed, from the moment they arrive. Read that again. A man who spent decades seeking divine consciousness in meditation and spiritual philosophy ultimately found it in the most ordinary place imaginable, in the unconditional worth of a child, in the truth he wished someone had whispered to him in Tijuana when the world was taking things from him it had no right to take. His face at 78 carries every chapter. The lines are deep. The eyes hold something that cannot be manufactured, a quality of witness, of having seen enough of the world's beauty and cruelty to no longer be surprised by either. Only moved. He does not chase youth. He does not perform vigor. He simply is, fully, unapologetically, magnificently present in the age his survival has earned him. And the music, always the music. In recent interviews, he speaks of it differently now. Not as a career, not as a legacy, not even as an art form exactly. He speaks of it the way people speak of breathing, as the involuntary, essential, non-negotiable act that confirms you are still here. When I play, he says, I am not Carlos Santana the celebrity. I am not the Grammy winner or the Rock and Roll Hall of Famer. I am just a boy from Jalisco who found a language that told the truth when nothing else would. There it is, the whole story in 2 sentences. Because that is what Carlos Santana has always been, beneath every accolade and every wound and every reinvention. A boy who needed a language honest enough to hold everything he could not say out loud. A boy who found that language in 6 strings and refused for 60 years to put it down. Not because fame demanded it, but because silence, for him, had always been the more dangerous option. He is 78 years old. He has outlasted trends, genres, scandals, collapses, and the quiet devastation of secrets finally spoken. He has loved, lost, fallen, and risen. Not once, but in the relentless, unglamorous cycle that constitutes an actual human life rather than a highlight reel. And still, every night, somewhere in the world, a stage is lit. He walks to the center of it. He raises the guitar, and the first note bends, and the crowd rises. And somewhere in that sound, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the boy from Otlin speaking the only language that ever told him the truth. Still here, still playing, still free. Carlos Santana did not survive 60 years of stages, secrets, and scars to become a cautionary tale. He survived to become a mirror. Because somewhere in this story, in the boy who converted wounds into music, in the man who collapsed under the weight of giving everything to everyone except himself, in the 78-year-old who finally set down what was never his to carry, somewhere in all of that, there is a reflection of something universal. The locked rooms we walk past every day. The languages we find when words fail us. The people we forget to take care of because we are too busy taking care of everyone else. What is the locked room you have been walking past? Not asking for the comment section. Asking for you. In the quiet after this video ends. When the screen goes dark and the algorithm moves on to the next story. What does your silence sound like? Carlos found his answer in 6 strings. You may find yours somewhere entirely different. But the finding requires one thing that took him 75 years to do: the courage to open the door. If this story moved something in you, if you heard yourself somewhere in these chapters, share it with someone who needs it tonight. Not for the views, not for the algorithm. Because somewhere right now, there is a boy from Auckland who never expected anyone to listen. And look what happened when the world finally did. Subscribe, and we will keep telling the stories worth hearing.